I'm scared to close my eyes. I'm scared to open them. We're going to die out here. This is the No Fear podcast. We know it scares you.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 7 of season 6, and we're starting a new episode series with the theme of found footage horror.
All right, so as y'all heard in our intro, Matt couldn't join us for this recording, but we are definitely going to miss him on this episode because we're starting a new episode series, and I'm really excited about it. We decided to kick off 2022 by talking about found footage and the kind of horror that goes around that. So, like we do with most of our episode series, usually the first in a series will kind of go over the history of whatever we're talking about, the subgenre that we're talking about, and then we'll kind of take a deep dive into why it's scary and why it fits horror so well. And this is no exception. We're going to start this off by talking a little bit about found footage and the history of it, at least in film. The opening quote, of course, is from The Blair Witch, which was the movie that came out in 1999. I think it is arguably the biggest of the found footage films. I think it's the one that people think of most when they think of found footage horror. So we're going to talk about that one a little bit, but there were some earlier ones. Before I really get into kind of talking about the history, I do want to just kind of give a little attention to a resource book that if this is something that you enjoyed, found footage horror in particular, there is a book called Found Footage Horror Films, Fear and the Appearance of Reality. It's a nonfiction book that was published in 2014 and written by Alexandra Heller Nicholas. I've read a lot of her stuff. Big fan. So I wanted to give that book kind of a little bit of a shout out. All right. So when we were really diving into the history of this subgenre, we wanted to trace it back as far as it would go. As far as horror movies are concerned, I think the first true kind of found footage horror film would probably be Cannibal Holocaust in 1980. Now, there may be a few that incorporate this element before that, but that was the first one that I think, in reviewing the films, really kind of hits it as this is a pure found footage film. Now, there has been earlier found footage films that were not necessarily horror. One that film historians really consider the first found footage film is a movie called The Connection, which came out in 1961. And it's supposed to be kind of a real look at the life of drug addicts. So the idea is that there is a filmmaker who agrees to do a documentary. And in exchange for doing this documentary, he finances these drugs for a group of addicts. And the filmmaker gets involved in trying the drugs, and it's a downward spiral for him. So I think that's really what we would consider the first found footage film. Excuse me. But again, I really think Cannibal Holocaust is considered the true first found footage movie that's in the horror genre. Now, that's, of course, the Deodato film. That's supposed to be people find footage of people making a movie in the Amazon rainforest. Now, this movie repeatedly has gotten banned because it was considered by a lot of people to be too graphic. It's kind of, I think, become infamous in the horror community. But part of it is that the footage, the found footage in this case, is supposed to be presented very realistically. And I think that's what adds to the gruesomeness of what happens. So those are really kind of the earliest ones. Now, there have been other ones that came in the decades since Cannibal Holocaust. So there now I haven't seen this one. There was a movie called Guinea Pig 2, Flower of Flesh and Blood, that came out in 1985. It's about a woman, somebody who kills women and films them as he's killing them. So a lot of these found footage, which I'm sure we'll talk about, are kind of mirroring the snuff films. And I think that's where it's trying to get the reality from. There was also a few other movies that came after one called The Last Broadcast in 1998, about local access TV producers who go into the woods and look for the Jersey Devil. If that sounds if that sounds familiar, it actually came 1 year before the Blair Witch Project. And so kind of the idea of getting lost in the woods and filming it a kind of faux documentary style, which is something again that I think we'll talk about in this. But I'm trying to think of some of the other ones that we'll probably want to hit in our discussion as we go about the series. But those are some of the earliest ones. I will really say the 80s and 90s, if you're looking at horror in particular, are probably going to be the earliest decades that you really get true, what we would consider true found footage horror. So, yeah, so that's some of them. Mel, I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this. You've seen the Blair Witch, right? Have you seen much found footage as far as horror films go?
You know, I saw Blair Witch Project, and I feel like I have seen other found footage movies, but I was having trouble earlier today, like pinning them all down. I should have sat down and forced myself to write them down. Another one that I've seen that comes to mind is I saw the first Paranormal Activity movie, which I don't even know how many of those there are now. How many of those are there? Four, five?
I don't know. I would venture to say too many of them. I've only seen I might have only seen the first one. And it kind of reminds me of a more recent film, at least the first Paranormal Activity, which I think this kind of fits with the found footage, is the movie Host, which came out in 2020. And
The Zoom one,
yeah,
right?
the Zoom one, just because
Mhm.
of the way it uses technology, because early on in the found footage genre, you had to have a reason for cameras to be around. So it was either going to be like a film crew making a movie, or a serial killer killing his, or videotaping his kills, or like like a faux documentary style of people trying to document what was like this spooky paranormal stuff that was happening, whether it be the Blair Witch or the Jersey Devil. But in the case of Paranormal Activity and also in Host, it kind of is a different type of found footage in that it takes the technology that we have in our daily lives and incorporates that, because a lot of Paranormal Activity was cameras that were placed around a house that might normally be there like for security reasons. I remember things in the kitchen, like seeing that really scary scene where the kitchen cabinets were opening and closing,
Mhm.
and it's all shot kind of from up above, and you have that kind of grainy quality to it. And then Host, they were all on Zoom, this group of friends doing a seance on Zoom because they were all in quarantine and kind of bored. And so that's a reason, like computer cameras or people's like cell phone cameras, those are all really good reasons for us to be recording things that could end up being found footage. So that's a good one to bring up, Paranormal Activity. I think it did kind of usher in maybe a more modern type of found footage.
Yeah, I think you're right, especially with the mix of like cameras that one would put out themselves and maybe security film. Another one that I thought of that I've seen is it's been a long time since I saw Cloverfield, but I think that also fits with this. And then another one I don't know, it's been a while since I've seen this movie, but does I know this I guess it would work as horror, it's definitely dark, but Super 8, does that movie qualify in some ways for found footage? It's been a while since I've seen it.
You know what?
The
That
kids are making the movie.
Yeah, I guess it would. Yeah, why not? I mean, a lot of these, and we'll talk about this, but a lot of these, it's hard to really draw the line between what is actually like found footage and what is a movie that incorporates different styles of documenting what's happening, I guess. Like Cloverfield is a mishmash of sometimes it's people's like cameras and they're taking video what's happening, but then it will switch out of that. So yeah, I mean, yeah, we'll throw Super 8 in there. Why not?
Well, something I watched recently, going off of what you were saying about how it's hard to tell if it's just pure found footage, I guess, or not. And I think we might have talked about this earlier today, actually, Lisa, is I recently watched the 2013 movie Europa Report, which is kind of space horror and kind of cosmic horror, basically. And I enjoyed it, but it's like found footage and documentary all at the same time. Basically, the premise is that these people disappeared while they were trying to get to Europa. Well, they disappeared from Earth's, like Earth didn't hear anything from them past a certain point, but they continued the mission on. And I can't remember how. I guess they send all the footage back at some point. But anyway, Earth gets all this footage that they took because they were recording everything, the whole mission. And so then the company that was sending them out into space to like find aliens on the moon of Jupiter, or to see if there was life there, puts together a documentary with the found footage. So the vast majority of the movie you're watching, just like what supposedly is the video cameras all over the spaceship or the shuttle or what you want to call it, and the video cameras that they're using to document their trip and their study. But it's all supposedly been put together by a documentary crew into a documentary form. And so I think, we had talked at one point about talking about kind of fake documentary horror. And I feel like some of these things that I think of when I think of found footage are actually probably like structured in that way, because maybe it's easier to organize it instead of saying like, here's just some footage I found. You actually organize it into, this is a documentary about it. A time travel version I saw back in probably like 2015 or 16. It isn't really horror, it's science fiction / time travel, would be Project Almanac, which is basically like these kids discovered, it's like Primer with teenagers, I guess. They're about to go to college and they invent time travel, and every time they use it, they have a camera with them. And by the end, it gets kind of in the paradox of how on earth are you actually recording all these things? Like, just, your camera's going to break, you're going to drop it. Like, how do you have these angles kind of questions? I feel like there are other ones I've seen, but they're just like escaping me right now and not on the tip of my tongue. Let me see. Oh, one. Lisa, would this count? Because we've talked before about the movie Lake Mungo, which I have not watched, but I want to watch. Would that be found footage massaged into a documentary?
Yeah, I've seen when I was doing some research into the history of found footage. A lot of people brought up Lake Mungo. I mean, for good reason. It's a great movie as being one of their favorite found footage films. And I think this is where we have to decide how, I guess, like how we're going to define it. I'm fine with like a faux doc, because I think it is faux documentary, but it's also found footage. Sometimes, like you said, you need that outside person to kind of take the what was left behind and make sense of it and make a narrative of it. So yeah, I think that would count, because other things that I was trying to think of that might constitute found footage, but maybe not in the same way as like, Blair Witch is very clearly they just had cameras out in the woods, something bad happened, and then people found that later and are just kind of presenting like this is what we found, and it's pure found footage. But then there's sometimes where there are movies like Sinister, which I think is a really scary film, but we're watching somebody put together the footage that they find. So we're like almost one removed from it. But Lake Mungo doesn't have that removal feel. It just feels like we're being led through this story in a different way. So yeah, I'll count it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And ironically, I just saw like an article about a new Netflix show across my social media feed the last couple of days, where they have a new found footage show coming out. Have you seen this?
Ooh,
It's
I
like
haven't.
it's a found footage / cult series, I think. I wish I could remember the title of it.
Well, that sounds right up my alley. While you're trying
When
to
I
think,
saw it, I thought this is Lisa's show. Archive 81, that's the title of it.
oh yeah, that sounds to be. I mean, found footage plus cults. Yes, it's like somebody made the perfect Venn diagram, and I'm in the middle.
But I think even in that, the conceit is that was it a woman was trying to make a documentary, and then so the archives are all her footage, and this guy comes in and is like trying to go through it and figure out what happened and if they can make something out of it. So I guess again, you have that frame to hold it
Yeah,
together in some way.
I think we can't get too nitpicky because there's almost always going to be a frame around found footage, with maybe the exception of Blair Witch, which has been so long since I've seen it. I think really the only real frame is you just are kind of told that this footage, like, these three filmmakers went into the woods and this is what they found. But most of them are going to have something because I think you need that for the narrative structure of it. I'm trying to think of a few others that might not have it. There was a great Spanish film called Wreck that came out. I want to say it was a few years ago, but it was probably realistically like 15 years ago, which feels like a few.
A few, yeah.
I can't remember the exact date on that one, but that was a really really scary, and it was composed of a bunch of people's like cell phone videos and things like that I think made it really terrifying. If I remember right, one of the remakes of Texas Chainsaw Massacre presented it like a found footage, kind of like it was the police archives. And I think that it was a very slim frame around that one, but you did kind of see the police going in at the beginning and finding the stuff. And you were kind of alerted as an audience member that this was now in police custody, and you're getting to see it type of thing. I'm not getting that confused with something else, which I very well may be. But yeah, I remember those. Yeah, I think a frame is probably needed for a lot of these for the found footage really to make sense.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to take us too far afield of the film, but this idea of the frame that we've been teasing out, like when I was thinking about this theme, when we first started talking about let's do a found footage themed series, I was trying to think of different found footage movies I had seen. We, immediately, as we often do, tried to figure out what the first one was. And while I was thinking about it, I started thinking to myself about the literary technique. And so, I was thinking to myself, it's got to be something that blurs boundaries between reality and fiction. And I started thinking of all these examples in books. And this is even going way back because I was thinking to myself, well, wouldn't the idea of found documents or letters in literature or journals or diaries or these sorts of things be kind of like a book way of dealing with this? And when you have a book like, say, Frankenstein or Dracula or some of Lovecraft's stuff, where it's people's journals and it's music and it's letters that were being written and just any sort of like found document you can think of, you have to have a frame or else it wouldn't make any sense. You have to have someone who claims, oh, I found all this stuff, therefore it's true, which kind of piques the reader's interest or maybe heightens it in some way. I mean, I even thought of the Scarlet Letter to a certain extent because you have the whole Custom House essay that people don't like to read where Hawthorne says he found part of he found a Scarlet Letter and like a manuscript that explained it was a real thing and it was kind of magical and whatever. And so I wondered if this is a phenomenon that kind of comes from books. And so then I started looking up like found footage books. And I also thought of House of Leaves, which I know you put a note in our document that you think that is an excellent found footage novel, Lisa. But I found an actual essay from the blog of the Peabody Institute, Library Peabody in Massachusetts. This would be like, well, near where Hawthorne was, actually. And they're like Reddit. If you look up found footage horror books or found footage books, there's tons of information where people are trying to come up with examples. And so this library in Peabody, Massachusetts talks about how they think Frankenstein and Dracula were like kind of early quote unquote found footage. And they list House of Leaves as an example. They list Edgar Quintero's The Supernatural Enhancements, which I thought was really interesting. That one is very postmodern, has security footage, tapes, audio tapes that they find, and just all sorts of letters and diary entries and things like that. And then the book We Eat Our Own, which I think you're familiar with, Lisa. But I don't know. The more I think about it, well, again, earlier today we were talking and we were just throwing out all sorts of examples of what could be found footage in literature, like Gemma Files' experimental film, like just literal, like a character in a book finds a film or a part of a film that's, is ambiguous and they're stuck on it or obsessed with it or is cursed. And I wonder, I don't know, I find it so interesting that people were doing this in books with the technologies that they had at the time, and it's kind of developed into film. And then as film became a thing, it seems like we've started to have found film footage in our books now. I don't know. As a person who loves postmodernism, I think that's just such an interesting connection. And there's something so scary about it, whether you're looking at it or you're reading it.
Yeah, that's really really true because again, it kind of in the way that found footage bleeds into the faux documentary style, I think it also bleeds into what you were describing, that like cursed media and finding something that maybe you're not supposed to see. There's a very like Lovecraftian idea. I'm thinking of the book like Universal Harvester, if you've read that kind of deals with that kind of idea. We Eat Our Own is a really interesting book by Kia Wilson, which is, I think it's less of found footage and more about like a movie like Cannibal Holocaust, where they're making a movie that is supposed to be found footage, but it's nonetheless like it's terrifying. It is a terrifying and really, really good book. But House of Leaves is a really interesting one because there you have layer upon layer, because even the framework source, and there are a couple really, you've got the found footage and then you've got the book being written about the found footage, like trying to make sense of it, but then you've also got the like main narrator who's reading the book and then trying to make sense of that. But each of the like layers in that story is its own type of found footage, because when you're holding it and you're reading it, and it has the like postmodern editions of like footnotes and that kind of faux academic style, which I guess is an offshoot of faux documentary. I'm getting myself very confused right now. But yeah, it lends a sense of realism that I think is smart, the way you connected, Mel, to the early, like, I mean, I guess what we would call like epistolary novels that were supposed to be letters between people, or where you were reading somebody's journal or diary. Yeah, I can definitely see the connections there. And like if you had told me, for instance, that Dracula might be considered a found footage book, I would have told you absolutely not. But now the more I'm thinking of it, I'm like, no, it really does. I think, and this may be a good point to kind of talk a bit about why this works so well in horror, because as you mentioned, this is not just a subgenre that belongs to horror. All sorts of genres have employed techniques with found footage, and I mean, especially the epistolary styles. But I think one thing that it does really well is it lends that realism to it. And we mentioned Blair Witch at the top as kind of being, I don't know, I'll call it the godmother of found footage films, even though it wasn't the first. I think its shadow looms large over anything that comes after it. And one thing I remember when that movie came out is the debates people would have over whether or not it was real. And I remember thinking that was ridiculous when people would say that, because I was like, why would they show this in the theater if this was real? But people really thought it was. And everybody, I think, Mel, before we got on this recording, I was telling you I would not watch Blair Witch again, not because it terrified me, but because I got so sick in the theater watching it. I'm not a person prone to motion sickness, but that was one of the elements that they employed in the film to add that realism was, like people running with cameras. And so it's all like shaky and grainy, or sometimes you have the camera fall over and you're seeing everything from like a side angle. Sometimes things are like really close up. There's that really famous part of the film where she's crying into the camera and the camera's really close. She's in her tent and you can see like the tears and you can see like the snot bubble coming out of her mouth or out of her nose. And it does feel very intimate, but at the same time, when you're watching it on a big screen, it can feel very off kilter because we're not supposed to. I don't know. We're accustomed to seeing film shot a certain way, but I do think that's one of the things that makes that film in particular very scary, but also just found footage films in general very scary is you don't have that distance from them. They feel very real. They feel like you're watching something that really either really did happen or really could have happened.
Yeah, I think that's the trick of it, is that it gets you kind of waffling over what's real or not. Even if you know the whole thing is fiction, it's still kind of lending some reality to it that you don't get if you're just being told a story. And I mentioned postmodern stuff earlier, but I think that's part of it too, because the idea of one of the ideas of postmodernism is that our experiences are fragmented, right? And so if you have fragments of things, you want to try to make sense of them. And I think these found footage movies or books, whether they let it just not make sense and you have to try to figure it out on your own, which is a way more experiential way of dealing with reading or watching a movie, or if they try to impose some order with a frame, I don't know. I feel like there's something unsettling about that there's something like unfinished about finding people's footage in the woods, or getting back footage from astronauts trying to get somewhere. Like, you're seeing people at these really, that something probably bad happened if they found their footage, like, coming back early or in the woods. And so I think, yeah, it's a mix of all these things, a mix of ambiguity and not understanding what happened, because you're probably not going to get the found footage itself is not, I think we talked about this on the Monster She Wrote podcast, is the writing yourself in a corner with journals and epistolary books, because if someone's writing a journal in a horror book, they have to like painstakingly write down what's happening to them at the end, to a certain extent, to explain it. And so, yeah, I think the ambiguity of found footage done right, where it really is kind of inexplicable and creepy, the weird almost reality of it that makes you identify with it more rather than having the mediator of a narrator. Yeah, I think all of this stuff like creeps us out. It might even be kind of verging on uncanny too, to lose that order.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head when you're describing why found footage works so well in horror and why I think more genres don't employ it. Whereas something like found footage in books, essentially where we're talking about like journals and letters and the kind of classic epistolary style. I think the reason, I mean, I'm just thinking like even like a book like Tristram Shandy is kind of a found footage, like going all the way back to
that's an excellent example, of an excellent way to describe that book.
found footage, yeah. But yeah, I mean, something like Tristram Shandy going back to, when was that, the 1700s?
Something like that, yeah, a long time.
Yeah, but where you have a book that's kind of mixed media as much as it could be back then, and but that is obviously not a horror book. That's actually a very funny book. It's very enjoyable. I really love it. But then when you make the switch specifically to visual, where you're talking about somebody filming something, I think the reason it works in horror is, like you were saying, it's that promise that something bad has happened and it delivers on that. But there's also, again, like you said, the ambiguity, because with these you very rarely get the end. Sometimes you do. Sometimes the camera keeps rolling even after the bad things has happened. But sometimes, as with, again, the godmother of them all, Blair Witch, it's going to cut off right before something bad happens, because if you're writing a journal, if you're writing a letter, you have already lived through whatever has happened and you can tell your own story. With found footage, the main character is rarely the one telling their own story. Usually, it's we are seeing the last moments of their life. And the reason people have picked them up is either because they are dead or missing. And knowing that going into a found footage film is very unsettling, I think. Yeah, uncanny might be the right word. Even though with most horror films, I think we expect as an audience something bad to happen at the end, right? Like if you're watching a slasher film, you know the body count is going to be high and there's probably going to at least be your final girl at the end. So you have these expectations, but with a found footage, the expectation truly is nobody comes out alive. That's why the footage is left to be found. That is a very heavy mood to go into watching a film. Yeah, I think it's just that the main character can't tell their own story. Like that agency has been removed from them. And unless, like you said, there's a framework and some sort of like documentary style where somebody's telling the story, it can be very unsettling too.
I just was thinking while you were talking, the idea of perspective and viewpoint and who has control of the narrative is really interesting when you think about genre and found footage. I don't know. Let me know if you agree with this theory I'm putting forward. But I find it interesting that while we were talking, I thought of a few more examples actually of found footage that I have experienced. But I was thinking about like the time travel one I mentioned, Project Almanac, of course, Primer, the big time travel that I think you could argue that parts of that are. That time travel movie that was on Netflix, I think it's See You Tomorrow. Again, people coming up with like invention or discovering something. And so they're videotaping themselves while they're doing it. That seems to be a trope in sci-fi that I hadn't really thought about, maybe coming from Frankenstein, but the idea of the scientist or the inventor who's on the verge of some great discovery or making something, and they're keeping like a video diary of it. And usually it's not that at the end they're showing it because everything's wonderful. Some sort of problem happens along the way. So I don't know. That might it also, I think, depending on your genre, might manipulate perspective as to who's in control of the story or why the recording or the writing is even being made.
Yeah, that's very true. The question of who controls the story and who controls the narrative is a really fascinating one. I know we're talking primarily about movies, but you had mentioned like House of Leaves, and I think that's one of the interesting ways to kind of get into that novel is to think about whose story is it exactly. You know, which perspective are you going to trust? And does it matter? Does it matter whose story it is and whose story it isn't?
Or can you trust anybody, really?
Or can you trust anybody? That because that's another thing with found footage, especially, is wondering. Not only, I mean, kind of going again, but it all kind of I think circles around the Blair Witch and connects to that. But the way audiences questioned whether it was real or not, I feel like that could be done intentionally in a movie, in a found footage movie, where you wonder, am I watching something that really did happen, or am I watching somebody trying to persuade me that it happened? So I'm thinking, I haven't seen too many found footage films that involve cryptids. I know there are a few out there that I would like to see at some point, but there. I mean, you think of Bigfoot, just not even talking about books and movies anymore, just like the idea of Bigfoot out in the world. So much of what we see as like quote unquote proof, like here's video proof or pictorial proof that Bigfoot exists. And then it will come out years later that it was actually a hoax and somebody did that. I feel like that's one of the questions that comes up with found footage films is you do have to kind of trust. There has to be some sort of implicit trust in watching it that it actually is true footage and not somebody kind of playing around with that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Like you have to have a feeling for where the footage originated from. That's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it this way before, but I wonder if Can you think of found footage movie? Like, are you thinking of a specific movie where we have a certain perspective as an audience and then it's turned on its head because we were tricked in some way? Because that would be interesting. Like if the
I'm sure.
people turning it into a documentary put their own spin on it, or were responsible in some way for what was happening, or some way to try to turn the tables on perspective.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Okay. There is a film. I hesitate to even say like too much because if you haven't seen the film, I don't want to spoil anything. But there is I think it's a Japanese movie called One Cut of the Dead that plays with that a little bit.
Ah, okay.
It definitely has the found footage aspect to it, and it also kind of plays an homage to like a cannibal holocaust type like film, kind of in the way that We Eat Our Own novel did, where it's about a film crew making a movie.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like it, kind of like found footage of a film crew making a movie, but it flips on its head in a really interesting way that I won't say anything else for fear of accidentally spoiling something. But that was one of my favorite films that I watched in 2021. So that does play with that. I'm trying to think if there are more films where that narrative was played, but I'm sure there has to be more than that.
Yeah, there's
I'm just
got to be.
probably not thinking of it, but that's a really kind of fun. I would think as a filmmaker that would be a fun thing to play with. To
Mhm.
kind of, and it would be something that you could do. I don't want to say easily, but it is something that, because I feel like once you're watching a found footage film, you kind of get swept up into it, and into there's an implied mystery in it. Kind of like, well, what happens? How does this footage get lost? How does it, kind of like the Blair Witch, they don't come out of the woods. So you're thinking, okay, well, am I going to get the answer to this mystery? Is it going to be unraveled? And yeah, that would be fun, I think, to subvert audience expectations with that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Another way you can use found footage is like investigation type premise, because you were talking about like mystery, so it could be like just a regular mystery, or it could be like exploration, or it could be paranormal investigation. Like I was thinking about how the podcast Black Tapes is a type of found footage experience, and that premise is looking at footage of paranormal things and trying to figure it out, and it seems like that's almost a ready-made frame.
Yeah, the Black Tapes is a really great example of that.
Such a good
Yeah,
podcast.
it really is. Oh, yeah. I'm kind of surprised. I bet there has to be, again, there has to be more found footage podcasts out there of people playing recordings, and it fits with the detective genre, the kind of mystery investigatory really well. I mean, there's a lot of crossover with that in horror, but now I'm wondering how much just mystery stuff there would be out there that is somebody piecing together found footage stuff. I would think a lot.
Yeah, because you're always looking for that surveillance camera or CCTV footage to figure out what was going on. Yeah, it lends itself really perfectly to that idea of a hodgepodge of pieces that you have to put together and make them make sense. And it was the sister podcast to Black Tapes, Tanis, that also had a found footage aspect to it, didn't it? I didn't finish it, but I mean, they were
No,
found documents and videos and some audio stuff, I think.
yeah, I have not. Yeah, I haven't. I don't think I listened to enough of that to really tell you. I honestly cannot remember any. I remember the Black Tapes really well, but I don't remember Tanis. So
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I couldn't tell you, but I think it seems like it fits. It definitely seems like it's kind of ready made to fit it. Gosh, these are really fascinating ideas, and I don't know. I feel like we could go on forever just kind of talking about how this could be applied to different genres. But We are running long on time, so I think we'll save that for future episodes. We're going to cover some of our favorite found footage movies and maybe a few of our favorite found footage books. We'll just have to kind of wait and see how that goes. So I hope you will join us on this journey. I know there's a lot we missed because we're just two people, and I know Mel and I have not seen everything, but I don't know. I'm really excited to kind of jump into this and see some new things and rewatch some old favorites. Before we go, I want to let our listeners know we've rolled out our new artwork for this season. Wonderful artwork that was commissioned from Lynn Hanson. She does a lot of book designs. I highly recommend looking at our website. But we also made some new merchandise, which we've never had before. I'm really excited that has her artwork on it. It's this great kind of throwback, I think, to 70s and 80s horror, like paperbacks in particular. It's exactly what I wanted it to be, and somehow also so much better than I ever anticipated. But up on our website, www.nofearcast.com. Remember, that's no spelled Know. We've got a store where you can buy our merch. We've got t-shirts, a hoodie. I think there's a mug, a sticker, smaller things like a notebook. And if any of that sounds like something you'd like to look at, or maybe if you want to buy a gift for a horror friend or family member, go ahead and check that out. I'm really excited to see it. I really hope that you do reach out to us. First, if you like our merch, we would love to know that, but also your favorite found footage film. We would love to hear that. Reach out to us on social media. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. Patreon is actually how we got the money together to get the new artwork and the new merch. So we're very thankful for people who support us on that. If you do choose to go over onto our Patreon and give us some money each month, you will get access to exclusive content. So we put out episodes every week. On the weeks in between our main episodes, we put out our special Patreon only episodes, and you'll get access to that. Or you can simply rate and review us. It is entirely free for you, but it does help other listeners find us. Our theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini. Thanks for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.